Palm Sunday introduces the week that we Christians revere and cherish as no other. We name it holy. We enter into the most awe-filled time of the liturgical year. My remarks this morning are in three parts. First, a qualification regarding the death of Jesus. Then, the setting of the lectionary reading in the context of Mark's gospel. And finally, concluding with a brief reflection on discipleship. Regarding the death of Jesus. In reflecting on the death of the Jew, Jesus of Nazareth, whom we Christians confess as the Christ of God, we must brook two deep and murky streams of religious and theological thinking. The one stream flows toward anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. The other toward supersessionism or replacement theology. Regarding this first stream of thought, let me state plainly and explicitly, the Jewish people did not kill Jesus. To say so disregards the religious and political realities of Roman-occupied first-century Palestine. Yet, it is quite likely that there were some forms of tacit support by influential priests in the arrest and handing over of Jesus to the Roman authorities. Regarding the second stream of thought, let me state plainly and explicitly. We Christians have not, cannot, and shall not replace the Jewish people in the heart of God. The covenant God initiated with the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob stands for eternity life. Now, some of you may recognize this phrase, eternity life, as a translation for eternal life offered a few weeks ago by Sister Mary Colo of University of Divinity, Melbourne, Australia. So the lectionary reading in its gospel context. The reading from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, verses 1 through 39, assumes that the hearer or reader remembers what has happened prior. In order to move forward, we step back to chapter 11 to focus on Jesus's entrance into Jerusalem and his disruption in the temple. In Mark's gospel, this incident seems to provoke the trials that send Jesus to his death. Chapter 11 opens with Jesus and his disciples on the road to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. Not too far from the city, he sends two disciples to a nearby village to find and bring a colt to him. They do as directed. Upon their return, the disciples threw their cloaks on the colt. Jesus mounted, then rode into Jerusalem. Along the way, many people caught sight of him and spread their cloaks and leafy branches on the road in front of him. When this impromptu procession reaches the temple, Jesus dismounts, enters the temple compound, looks around, then leaves along with the 12 to spend the night in Bethany. The next day, Jesus returns. There are times, New Testament scholar Amy Jill Levine observes, quote, we may find that business as usual is not only inappropriate, it is obscene. Something has to be done, close quote. Perhaps this is how Jesus felt when he looked around the temple compound. He could not stomach what he saw. And on his return, he disrupted business as usual. He pushed and shoved vendors and money changers, overturned their stalls and tables, scattering coins and small animals. If hundreds, perhaps thousands of pilgrims were milling about in the outer court of the temple, single-handedly, Jesus could have chased away only a few vendors and money changers, could have upended only a few tables and stalls. But he took a stand. Theologian Jose Pagola maintains that even if Jesus's action in the temple was, quote, a gesture, small and limited, nonetheless, it was charged with prophetic power, close quote. After the commotion settled, Jesus preached to those gathered near him. Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations? but you have made it a den of robbers. This is Mark 11, 15 to 17. After this incident, once again, Jesus retires to Bethany. So we take chapters 11, verse 27 through 14, verse 32. Over the next 2 or 3 days, Jesus and the disciples go back and forth between Bethany and Jerusalem, returning repeatedly to the temple where he teaches and preaches, holding the people spellbound and delighted. But Jesus's disruptive behavior and his obvious influence over the people unnerved and angered the temple establishment. They want to stop him, but do not act because they are afraid of the people. On the evening of the first day of unleavened bread, Jesus and his disciples eat their festival meal, but their joy is marred by his predictions of betrayal, denial, and death. After the meal, he walks with Peter, James, and John to Gethsemane. Not long after, with Judas's help, temple guards arrest Jesus and take him to Caiaphas, the high priest, who has assembled the council, the chief priests, scribes, and elders. Although we have no way of knowing what actually happened at this event, the gospel tells us that the testimony given against Jesus was contradictory. This lack of agreement among the witnesses violated a key stipulation in Torah regarding convictions. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, the death sentence shall be executed. A person must not be put to death on the evidence of only one witness. This is Deuteronomy 17:6. Finally, Caiaphas demands Jesus to reveal his identity. He does so, and his answer seals his fate. The council convicts Jesus of blasphemy and sentences him to death. We have now arrived at the lectionary reading. I'll try to take this in 3 parts. In Mark 15, 1 to 15, Jesus is handed over to the Roman procurator. Blasphemy could have been of no interest to Pilate, so the charge now must be political. In the midst of the oppressive social, economic, and political context of the Roman Empire, Jesus carried out a compassionate and prophetic praxis rooted in covenant faithfulness in response to the coming of the Basileia Tau Teo, the empire of God. Indeed, Jesus's very use of the term Basileia, empire, indicted imperial rule. Jesus had imagined and proclaimed a vision and way of life that contested the Pax Romana. Such talk was seditious. Jesus was dangerous, disruptive, drawing crowds. He had to be stopped, and by any means available. The question Pilate asks is the political one. Are you the king of the Jews? Jesus replied, you say so. During the remainder of the trial, Jesus stands in silence. When the shouting of the fickle crowd subsided, Pilate pronounced the death sentence and handed over Jesus to the soldiers for crucifixion. This is the second part of this longer narrative that we're reading. In Mark 15, 16 to 21, after Pilate renders the verdict, soldiers took Jesus into an inner courtyard where the whole cohort, about 500 soldiers, assembled. They stripped, abused, and flogged Jesus. They put a purple cloak around him, made a crown of twisted thorn branches, and put it on him. They mocked and ridiculed him. Hail, King of the Jews. Their brutality appeased, an execution squad pushed and shoved Jesus to Golgotha. When he stumbled, the soldiers conscripted a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, a North African, to carry it for him. The word crucifixion derives from the Latin cruciare, meaning to torture. The Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero described crucifixion as, quote, the most extreme form of punishment. And the Jewish historian Josephus called it, quote, the most pitiable of deaths, close quote. The Romans typically used crucifixion to punish rebellious slaves, violent and dangerous criminals and traitors, and to pacify already subjugated peoples who dared to persist in rebellion. In the ancient world, death on a cross was deemed utterly offensive and obscene. But the most insulting and derisive aspect of crucifixion was leaving the body unburied to rot or to be eaten by wild beasts or birds. As a spectacle of capital punishment, crucifixion was not directed merely at the individual victim. It was a deterrent aimed to silence and intimidate, terrify and terrorize anyone who might share ideas similar to those of the crucified. A Jew from the backwater Galilean town of Nazareth dared to threaten the Roman Empire, made himself king of the Jews. Perhaps Pilate acted cynically when he had this inscription carved on a placard affixed to Jesus's cross. Nonetheless, crucifixion was the response of the Roman Empire to Jesus's struggle for the empire of God, his struggle for a transformative politics of beloved community. In this final section now, Mark 22 to 39, we see Jesus hanging naked, humiliated, and alone on the cross. One disciple had betrayed him. Another had denied him. All the other male disciples had fled. Passers-by jeered at him. Some of the priests and scribes taunted him. Even the criminals executed with him reviled him. Yet throughout those agonizing hours, a few faithful disciples, women, kept vigil. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and Salome stood as close as they dared, storing all that they had seen and heard in their hearts. About 3 o'clock, Jesus screamed, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me? This cry reflects his utter desolation, the trauma of physical pain and of psychic humiliation, the emotional anguish at mockery and misunderstanding, the dark spiritual anguish, fear that his God had abandoned him. It is this moment, Bonnie Thurston contends, Jesus enters into the darkest experience that humanity can face. His cry comes from the first line of Psalm 22. And while that psalm concludes with testimony to God's gracious fidelity and vindication, the bitter blow it expresses cannot be mitigated. Jesus then breathed his last. The Roman centurion who supervised the execution sees this man die a brutal and shameful death and declares, quote, "Truly this man was God's son," close quote. New Testament commentator Emerson Pomeroy points out that, quote, "This is the first human confession about Jesus as Son of God in Mark's narrative," close quote. His acknowledgement parallels the opening of Mark's gospel. At Jesus's baptism, a divine voice from heaven embraces him with these words, "You are my son, the beloved." Just as the gospel began with the tearing open of the heavens, so it closes with the tearing of the veil of the temple. Let me close with a few brief reflections on discipleship, on following Jesus. Mark's telling of the good news, the story of God's vivifying presence, valiantly enfleshed among us in the Jew, Jesus of Nazareth, reaches out to meet each of us individually and collectively as we are, enmeshed in our particular and dynamic historical, religious, cultural, and social contexts. What does it mean to follow Jesus? To live Christian life in a country, in countries dominated by white racist supremacy? What have we done to help our sisters and brothers respond to, and live the command of neighbor love. What have we done to repudiate racism, acquisitive materialism, and violence? What have we done to eliminate misogyny, homophobia, transphobia? What have we done to eradicate anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, hatred of the other? How do we followers of Jesus participate in enfleshing the empire of God? Or have we gotten ourselves in too deep debt to Caesar? Have we anesthetized the critical and liberative, dangerous and unnerving message of Jesus? Have we quietly surrendered to the obscenity of business as usual? In the second decade of the 21st century, we Christians in the United States continue to grapple with twin pandemics: the lethal coronavirus that continues to devastate human life on our planet, and white racist supremacy that seeks to purge people of color and so-called undesirables from the white body politic. We must not overlook the hate increasingly directed at children, women, and men of Asian descent. Just a few weeks ago in Georgia, 6 women of Asian descent were murdered. We Christians have not yet even begun to approach the challenge laid down by James Cone to identify the lynched Jesus in all those abused, battered, raped, murdered bodies piled up at the doors of our churches and our consciences. We are crucifying again the Son of God and holding him in contempt. Hebrews 6:6. The call to discipleship, the summons to walk the way that Jesus taught, is at once the same for all of us, yet distinctive for each of us. That way will include shouldering our crosses, but the command to follow is not a command to search out and look for suffering. Rather, suffering is a consequence of conforming our souls, our hearts, our minds, and our behaviors to the life-affirming praxis of Jesus. Inevitably, we disciples will experience pain and privation, loss and longing, confusion and failure. But the way Jesus is opens us to the wisdom and power of the Spirit. And just as the cross hallowed in Jesus capacity for resurrection, so too cruciform discipleship seeds resurrection eternity life in us.